So my name is John Cvetko. I've been in IT 20 plus years. I've worked with a number of different companies and organizations, governments, help them with large projects. Sometimes I come in and help tweak projects, give advice, and sometimes come in and try to do a turnaround of it. Just a variety of different experiences from which I'll draw from today. If at any point I kind of fade, let me know. I had a pretty bad cold this weekend, and so I may kind of fade, but just kind of pipe in and let me know. Okay, so the title is Fallacies of Data-Driven Decision Making, or DDDM. So what is data-driven decision making? You have data, gather it up, you analyze it, you try to figure out some conclusions from it, and then you make a decision, right? Pretty straightforward stuff. So in my line of work, I often walk in fresh to an organization and I just see a ton of bad decisions. My overarching question is, why are there so many bad decisions? Well, as you kind of dig into it, you do find some patterns. Often you have bad or false or incomplete data. Bad data means that the data wasn't really put into the system correctly. A lot of times people do workarounds or whatever. False data, sometimes people fudge the data to get the impression that they want. Or incomplete data. They didn't pull all the data that they required to give a well-rounded analysis, right? So another component is the analysis, right? Oftentimes you'll have biased or poor analysis, and many times you'll have non-existent analysis. Oftentimes I find that business personnel may or may not be able to put together a full business case in some sense. If you've done it before, then it's fairly easy to do. If you've never done it, then it's very challenging. If you have an MBA, then typically you could probably do it, but a lot of times you go into places and people just can't put that together. So analysis is challenging, both technically and from the business perspective. Options for consideration based on artificial constraints. So sometimes organizations just look at what they think they can do based on the organization or who they are, right? It's kind of like an inferiority complex, right? We can't do that because we don't have this money or we don't have this, that, whatever. And so they don't lay all the options on the table for consideration. And you never know, sometimes if an option is laid on the table, people find money. But they artificially constrain themselves. Risk and dependencies are not clearly considered. They're not clear or considered. People don't usually think in terms of risk, but they need to kind of say things that could go wrong with every option, even the options they like. And they also need to talk about their assumptions. And their assumptions are usually end up being dependencies of some way, shape, or form. And if you see, there are no assumptions in the business case, or there is no risk that look, reasonable, then chances are you're looking at something that is being kind of fudged one way or the other. And then, of course, subsequent decision-making, governance, right? So the sponsor comes in, makes a decision, and then they walk away. But there's 10,000 more decisions down the road, and they have to govern all along the way. So what do all these have in common? It's people. People are people, right? And they come from different walks of life, and often, a lot of times they come into organizations for a year or two, and then they move on to something else. So you have a lot of variability with respect to people. A couple years back, I picked up this book, right? Jeff Sutherland is the father of Scrum. One of the fathers was another fellow. And he also went on to do SAFe, and he's creator, or he is a chairman of Scrum.org, and he has a long list of Scrum accolades, right? Being a thought leader in the Scrum world. He was a fighter pilot, came to find out, in Vietnam. And he also has advanced degrees, right? And he's got an MD. And then he went on to start companies, and just a long list of career achievements. And at one time, he was working at IBM, and he, I think he was on the hardware side. I forget which side he was on, but he teamed up with his partner, and they were, saying there has to be a better way to do this. And so out of that was born Scrum. And so The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time is his book. It's a fairly lightweight book, and if you do get a chance, I'd recommend reading it. But in the book, you stumble across this odd little thing called the OODA loop, OODA, and it stands for Observation, Orientation, Decision, and Action. And so he talks a little bit about this and why he included it. And primarily, he came across this because he was a fighter pilot. And so he was trained a certain way by the US Air Force. And he was trained on the tactics developed by this fellow, Colonel John Boyd. So Colonel Boyd is a real character. I mean, if they were going to do Top Gun and Maverick, this would be your guy. He is very irreverent, very in your face, wants to do, I forget how he said it. He said he wants to do something rather than be somebody. And that's most likely why he never got above colonel. So 42nd Boyd, nicknames, he's a fighter pilot. Genghis John, the Mad Major, and then there's a couple other salty ones that I didn't present here. Started his career out in an F-86 Sabre in Korea. Never really had a combat. He was in combat, but he never had shot down anybody. And in Korea, the F-86 plane was inferior to the MiG at the time. So the North Koreans were using MiGs, Russian MiG. So the Russians made a plane that was purpose-built towards dogfighting, and the F-86 could not technically keep up with it. So he had to figure out how to deal with that. And so the only thing he could really change is his thinking. And so he developed what he called the OODA loop. So as he developed the OODA loop, he began to teach everybody this process and as a flight instructor. And so this became kind of part and parcel to the fighter pilot school training. And that's where Sutherland picked it up. So he's noted for doing the aerial attack study. Prior to Korea, dogfighting was considered an art, not a science. And so he, because of jets came along and things were much more, happened very quickly, you didn't have time to kind of think. And so he kind of put his OODA loop into a thing called the aerial attack study, which is basically the handbook of how to fight in jets. Also came up with the energy maneuverable theory, right, or maneuverability theory. And basically, it's a way of characterizing planes and how they would do in a dogfight. And to run the calculations on all the different planes in the U.S. Inventory, as well as the planes in Russia's inventory, he had to steal time on a computer on a base. And so there's this great little story about he did all this backroom maneuvering, just really unconventional fellow. Then he came up with this theory of organic design for command and control. And as you can imagine, in the military, they don't like to hear about organic design for command and control. They want to hear command and control. So this, again, rubbed people the wrong way. Part of the fighter mafia. It's an interesting story. Back in the 50s, after they dropped the atomic bomb, they thought, we don't need fighters because we're in the atomic age. All we need to do is make bombers. And so they were in this period where they couldn't figure out if they did need one or the other. And so they were creating fighter bombers. And fighter bombers were not going to win a dogfight. And so they created this fighter mafia, and these guys were the fighter camp. And so this is where your F-16 and your F-15, your F-18, 22, all those designs stemmed from this component. He ended up being a commander in a CIA base. So as I was reading this book, I thought halfway through I had to put it down, and I was just tired. The stuff that this guy did in 1 year, most people wouldn't do in a lifetime. So he ended up being commander of a CIA base in Vietnam, in Thailand. And there he was basically there to shut down an IBM project that they had. And they know nobody else had the gumption to do it. So they sent him over, and he was happy to do it for him. And he came up with this notion of maneuver warfare. So if you guys, anybody has been watching the Ukrainian war footage at all, you see how they swooped in, they took major pieces of the territory. That's maneuver warfare. The way they did it, the speed, the approach, all that is from this fellow. And he was also credited for planning the first Gulf War. If you all remember the shock and awe, that was from his theories. So why in the heck am I talking about a fighter pilot from the 50s? Well, he created this mind model, right, which is observe, orient, decide, act, cycle, OODA. It stemmed from the need to rapidly adapt thinking. He couldn't change the technology that quick. And so what he could change is the way he thought about dogfighting. And so he went down this path. Basically, the pilot who could process information the fastest will outmaneuver his opponent. And so every person, I'm paraphrasing him, every person has their own OODA loop inside their brain. And so if you can get inside your opponent's brain and run the loop faster, then you can begin to anticipate what your opponent is going to do. And thus you'll win the dogfight. The idea is that this OODA loop was intentionally designed by him to create chaos in the mind of the opponent. What he wants to do is get inside the head of the mind of the opponent and begin to, lack of a better term, mess with them. And then he thought, well, if I could do this with an individual, I could also do it with an organization, right? Which you would want to do if you're in a large scale operation. So why would Sutherland want to put such an oppositional model in his book? I mean, this is like completely orthogonal to what Agile is supposed to be, right? Boyd was very pragmatic. He knew that he was creating a methodology that was a force to reckon with. I mean, you could go anywhere and if you applied these principles, you could be very, very effective, very quick, very swift and quick. And so he realized that he needed to defend against his own tactics. And so what he decided to do is to say, if I were to defend against this, how would I do it? And so he would have to create an organization with the following characteristics. need to be able to rapidly process information, need to leverage the individual, diversity, genetic culture, creativity, improvisation, right? You need to maximize adaptability and innovation. And he needed to glue these people together through a culture of trust. And then this would allow for decentralization of management through a shared mindset. So an officer could give his intent to the subordinates, and the subordinates would understand what to do. He didn't have to tell them in detail. And so this was part of his organic command and control, right? Being able to decentralize, offload more information and more responsibility to the frontline people. Now, this was completely different than World War II. In World War II, the soldiers were considered pretty much a tool in a lot of cases. At a certain level down, they're considered a tool. And here he was saying, no, you're missing the point. The point is that person, they bring a lot to the table, and it should be harnessed in some way. And so what he was trying to do, right, he wanted to take the OODA loop from a one-off, right, very focused, swift and agile thing to a much larger organization. But the challenge is to get the organization to be agile, you have to change the culture, right? You have to build it from the ground up. And that was one of the reasons that he rubbed so many people the wrong way, is because he was professing a new culture, and this new culture would be able to adapt to technology at a much more rapid pace, right? Because he saw technology coming. And so he just anticipated that there was going to be so much coming at you that you had to be able to adapt to it and then put that into the inventory of tools. And also you had to be able to adapt to what's coming at you with respect to tactics. And so that ability to maneuver such a large force flexibly and fast, that's something that business people picked up on. So there's a lot of business people that have used this approach, as well as Jeff Sutherland with respect to Scrum. So back to why did Sutherland use this? Well, the goals align. Boyd's goal was to minimize time and maximize effectiveness. Sutherland's goal was the art of doing twice the work in half the time, right? Same thing. And Boyd always quotes Napoleon, I think. Napoleon said, I think it was, if I had the choice between losing ground and losing time, I would always take losing ground, because you can never get time back. And so time was extremely important to Boyd's way of thinking. Okay, let's kind of dig into this a little bit, because this is some of the basis for the agile mindset. And so the first component of the OODA loop is observe. And so from the perspective of a mindset, right, the first thing you do is you observe your world, all 5 sentences or senses. It's it could be somebody talking to you, there's concepts coming at you, there's just all these different things. Certain things you pay more attention to than others, right? As these things come in, you have to somehow orient yourself to what's coming in. And this was very important to Boyd, because they were going into very chaotic, complex situations where they don't know what is going to happen, but they know that they have to process it very quickly and then move forward. And so the orientation phase basically is a way of people understanding what they're looking at. And so somehow they have to bring that in, and they have to link it, to anchor it to some type of pattern that they currently have in their brain. And if they don't have that linkage, then they have to begin to figure out, okay, how do I interpret this and store it for future reference, right? And so there's a process we'll talk about here in a second about how you do that, or how he postulated people do that. The next is out of the orientation phase, and you'll have some decisions. Either you've done analysis and presented some options, or you know exactly what to do. You have to make a decision, and then you have to act upon that decision. So Lloyd was very reticent to ever come up with a plumbing diagram, as he called it. And he only put this together in 1996. So you can imagine he came up with the idea in the 50s, late 50s, and he didn't put it down on paper until 96. And he was very reluctant to do that because once it's fixed, then it kind of loses its flexibility in some way. At least that was in his mind. There are other reasons for doing that. He, had to kind of change the culture in the Pentagon, and the more stuff he wrote down, the more stuff they could tweak and twist and this and that. So, but he never did write a book, and so he only has a number of short, brief papers in some cases, and other cases just PowerPoint slides, and then you'll find a few videos online. Actually, pretty interesting. It takes a long time to really understand what he's saying, because he's really from a different perspective, and he dove so deep into this. I mean, he studied philosophy, and he studied engineering, physics, religion, military strategy. Just he kind of brought it all together, and he came up with this orientation component. And so the loop changed right over time. So originally it was just observation, orientation, decide, and act. And he would kind of talk about the orientation. But as he began to think about it in a larger context, right, how to get people to work together, then he wanted to dive deeper into that. So the orientation component, he has four main components. Cultural traditions, where a person is their belief structure, how they, what people do in their lives and their community and this and that. Genetic heritage, right? They're from a certain place. It could be a certain religion, on and on and on, right? They think differently than others. And then you have previous experience, right? This is what I'm used to. This is what I've seen before. And then through the lens of my culture and through the lens of my genetic heritage. And then I have this new information that comes in that I have to figure out what to do with that. Somehow I have to reconcile in these places. So then he has this component called the analysis and synthesis. And so as the information comes in, you begin to try to figure out, okay, have I seen this situation before, or condition or whatever? And it begins to try to pattern match from your culture, traditions, your heritage, your previous. It's trying to figure out, okay, where have I seen this before, or what looks similar to this that I can kind of model from. And so that's that analysis component. And then what you want to do, or what happens, is that those ideas are synthesized and then they're presented up as options to be decided upon. Okay. Boyd had one of his presentations, I think, was called Destruction and Creation, and it centers around analysis and synthesis. And in one of his videos, he goes on and on and on. If you call me an analyst, I'll hit you, right? He said, being just an analyst is not sufficient, right? Anybody can pull things apart. You want to be able to pull things apart, but you want to be able to bring them together, because as you pull apart, bring together, pull apart, you're mashing things up. The more you mash things up, something is going to pop out, some type of creative idea or some type of innovation. And so he was very adamant about this process. And he has this example of what is it, the snowmobile, right? It's motorcycle, it's a ski, skis are on it and all this, and all these different standard things, motorcycles, bike, whatever, and you break them all down into their component parts, but then when you put them back together, you end up with a snowmobile. It's kind of a 1950s flavor to it, but you kind of get the idea. So the OODA loop, this is what he drew, and left to right. So the unfolding circumstances, the outside information is, the environment that you're in. The observation is what you see, is your reality, right? That information gets pushed over to the orient phase, and that's where you then try to do these pattern matches. Try to put it up against something that you have seen. I'm sorry, there's a chat question. I don't know. Ajia, I don't know if you can see that, but anyway, we'll pick it up at the end. We're pattern matching, right? And that could take time. And then you have options, and then you may or may not have to make a decision. If you don't have to make a decision, then you can just store it away or wait, some more time until something else happens, something else unfolds in front of you. Or you may want to, have a hypothesis or an inkling of something, and you may want to have change something in your observation. And so there's that corrective feedback loop, right? And so at the decision point. So it's a rapid cycling of information through the brain. Once a set of options are listed that can be dealt with, then it is passed on to the action component. So the action component, you may say, action, go do something physically or say something or whatever, but it could also be action of just storing this information away for later use, or it could be maybe I want to test something, to test a small element to see what happens, right? I want to zig a little left to see if my opponent will zig a little left, right? Before you make a major action, see how tuned in he is. So once that is all kind of dialed in, then a full action from left to right, your full action would take place. Now, this is the slowest of the loops, right? So you basically have 3 loops here, 2 feedback loops and 1 main loop. So this is the slowest of the loops because it takes time to pattern match and to go through these processes. And so when you're in the middle of a dogfight, in this case, you don't want to spend a lot of time and energy trying to figure things out. You want to have a lot of these things preloaded. And this is where the training would come in, right? You train this way, you train that way, going through all these different gyrations. If he does a scoop up and does a circle above you or whatever, you do this just instinctively. And so until you learn that, this is kind of the effort that you have to put into learning the skill. So this is the slowest of the loops, and it requires most energy. On the top of the diagram, you'll see implicit guidance and control. And these are areas where you don't, you've been through this already. You understand the pattern match is simple. The decision in this case, this is what I call the implicit guidance and control, the IGNC reflexa. So it just kind of is a reflex. You think of, somebody throwing a soccer ball at you, right? And you're a pro soccer player, but you're gonna immediately chest it or get it down to the ground in some way, shape, or form, reflexively. I call it the 10,000 hour rule. You have all this time put in that the pattern is just evident. So it comes in, it goes right to action, and that is fast, right? That's where he wanted to be primarily. And he would describe it in, he would say, it's your fingertips. It's already at your fingertips. And I kind of liken it to a IndyCar driver who drives their car and they can feel the road through their fingertips. It's just instinctive because you have spent so much time doing it. And then there's the other side of the IGNC, right? This is the proactive, or this is the goal-oriented side. This is, it's not instinctive like the last one, but it's something that's very familiar. You know this kind of space, and you can kind of sort through it. I kind of call it like if there's a very noisy environment, but you see something that you know to tune in to the thing that really matters. And so this is a very powerful approach too. So this is, again, through experience, right? So you've seen this before, you know generally how this is going to play out or what you need to do in this type of situation. And so the route through the decision, the action is relatively fast. You're just really adapting, minor adaptions, right, to what you're looking for. An example of this would be, say I'm a business analyst and I'm going to meet with my client, and I decide, my job, my job is there to pull requirements from my client as best I can. So I'm in my requirements gathering mindset, right? And so I'm looking for certain words, phrases, pain points, these different things. And so that's a good way to kind of think about that component. Now, this is one of the most dangerous components too, because you can overtune, right? And you can overdrive what you're looking at, or your observation of what you're looking at. And so this almost moves into, this is moving into what you want to see, right, happen. You have not necessarily, so you're not necessarily listening potentially or observing as best you can. And so there's this really fine balance with the proactive IGNC, right? So you have to be very careful with that. So imagine, again, I'm a business analyst and I meet with a client to discuss requirements, but I already have this thing in my head that I want to see this specific requirement in this system. And so I'm leading the client down a certain path, right? And even if he doesn't say what I want to hear him say, in some cases he may say that, I heard this, I think I heard this, and basically you're just kind of reinforcing what you want to do. Okay, so one more thing on these loops. There's a tempo component to this, a time component. And so these loops, may happen in the blink of an eye. Even the first loop could happen in the blink of an eye, or it could take long periods of time. Boyd was obsessed with speed, but as he began to evolve the model, and he's talking now about the macro level, he understands that things will move slower, right, than an individual in a jet plane. And so he has this notion of time. And so you may sit in the first loop for a long period of time, or you may iterate through that loop, doing the same pattern over and over and over again, fine-tuning that pattern. Imagine if you're developing a system, right, and you're working on a specific module, or you're testing a specific area, you may test that for a week, right? And it may use the same pathway over and over and over again to try to get to the final conclusion that you need long term. So there's some variability in time. There is a huge emphasis on speed, but speed is relative to the size of the organization that you're trying to deal with. Just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So now the trick is, as we showed previously a couple slides ago about the two orientation components sitting side by side, you want to be able to have the individuals work together in a way that they can move very quickly, efficiently, and be very effective, right? And so they have to have this kind of shared orientation. And that's why you often hear about the agile mindset and propagating the agile mindset to, help change the culture of an organization. This is what they're saying, is that you have to understand the shared environment, and the idea is that you all share the agile methodology or philosophy. And so there's specific training, there's certain ceremonies, right? You have your retrospective, all these things. And so these are just kind of part and parcel. Everybody expects every Friday we get together and do it. This is how this all works. And that commonality helps you to begin to think in short, like winks and nods and acronyms, and sometimes they just anticipate, if he does this, I know he's going to do this, I'm going to do that. And it's a different level of being able to work together, right? And in the military, weirdly enough, is that when somebody gets separated, and when a group gets separated, they can begin to anticipate what that person will do, because they have the shared mindset. Even though they're very far away and they can't communicate, they can kind of get a sense of maybe, they would go this way or this way because of certain conditions in what they're seeing. So there's that connectivity that can span space. So what they would do in the military particularly is they would run through many different exercises in fighter school, right? You go up and you practice, and you do this and you do that, and you're just honing your skill set. Kind of the same thing here. Everybody's seeing the same patterns over and over and over again. So everybody kind of knows what needs to be done. And you can imagine at times you may need to move fast, like with respect to security, right? Or a system down. Everybody, you just don't want to sit around and talk when you're having a breach, in the middle of a breach. You want people to go and do what they're supposed to do. I was reading just the other day on this, is that security used to, really lay in on plan, do, check, act, which is the Deming cycle, which is good for putting things into production. It's very good for putting things into production. But when you're trying to catch an intruder, or you're trying to track an intruder, you don't want to use plan, do, check, and act, because that you can't plan what they're going to do. You want to use the OODA loop, right? You want to try to figure out what this person is doing, why they're doing it, who they are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're trying to anticipate where they're going or what they're doing. It's the first time I've ever seen that, so that was kind of interesting to me. Okay, real world examples. So a lot of times you come into organizations, you're called there for a reason, because they have problems, and they all have problems. One of the things is that when you're inside a system, right, when you're inside an organization, you can't necessarily see the problems, because the problems become your way of life, right? Just stepped into an organization last year, and it's kind of one of those things, you walk in and it's like walking up to a car accident, right? It's like, wow, what happened like 5 minutes before this moment in time? You just kind of wonder. So, but everybody there was like, we just do this, we just do that, we work around this. So there's this big kind of mess, and they just have seen the mess for so long, they just work around it. And so sometimes it's very good to have a set of eyes come in and say, hey, there's a mess here, it needs to be fixed. So these are all true stories, and if you guys want some more, we can do some more after. But this one wasn't too bad. Did kind of catch my ear at first. So it was a large medical group. They outsourced their software development to a Fortune 500 software consultancy. The medical group, as part of the contract, they were to conduct the UAT, the final business testing, and they had to certify it prior to releasing it to code. And this is how the vendor would get paid. If they certified it, it had X amount of bugs or whatever, then they could release it to production. And there's just more to that. But the vendor developed a release train, right? And so the release train, very large system, so they would have 10, 20 projects into any one release. Projects could be very large components of the system, upgrades, whatever, or it could be small things. And so those were all called projects. And at the final stage, they would pull it all together, and then they would send it over to the test. And then, so then the UAT manager would have to get his people to test this. The challenge was that the sprint cadence and the release sizes were not consistent. So, which is fine for the vendor because they have flexible capacity on their end, but the UAT test group did not, and so they were being jammed up at certain times. Right? In this case, release 1 would come through and they'd be fine. Release 2 would come through and it's like, oh, and then release 3 would be right behind it. Just shortened in time. So it was causing a lot of havoc. And at one point, I've heard that the QA manager was upset in general, and there was a rumor that he had the vendor's contract laminated, page by page laminated on his desk. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Never heard about that one before. And so, we're getting, I'm kind of monitoring some release meetings, and right before launch, I hear that there's a number of priority 1 bugs. And I'm like, wait, I was here last week and there's no priority 1 bugs all of a sudden. And so, I went back and I started looking at some of the data, pulled the data from previous releases, and I could see that there was a pattern, right? So when the code was released into test, you'd see a spike of priority 1 bugs, which, it's not uncommon. And then it would kind of die down to just priority 2 bugs. And then right before release, it would spike back up. And I thought, that's interesting, and I gotta go look at that. So I dug a little deeper, and
John, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we only have about 1 minute left for the presentation.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll try to wrap it up here, and then we can discuss questions, or if not, I'll just keep rolling on. And so in this case, what happened was the QA manager would talk to his management, would tell them this is a problem. We can't have this variability. We have to have it more fixed. But the vendor, didn't have that requirement in their contract. It would be deaf ears, right? And so what he would do is he would, per the contract, he was allowed to do this. He could take his priority 2s and bump them to priority 1s. And he can't release with the priority 1s. So what he was doing was he was putting the brakes on the vendor. And at first I thought, well, this is all nonsense, right? But then I got to going through this presentation, putting all this together, I thought, that was a pretty creative solution. It's not standard. I wouldn't recommend it. However, he held product quality, which was very important. Well, I'm sorry that I ran over. There's a few more. This one here was primarily, our business is unique primarily a system was built from the ground up. They kind of gained the alternatives analysis. The project manager, the development team, they architected a system, didn't work, and they had to use a piece of the system. They had to try to put a square peg into a round hole, which created bad data in the end. And so then that was an example of your implicit GNC, right? So they already knew what they wanted to do. They knew the technology. They knew that they wanted to build a house, right? So they're pushing in that direction. Well, the final result was a failed architecture, but also they severed a good relationship between themselves and the business. And then the last one was a pivot and snap. And if I could just take one more minute, this one is, part of the idea of moving a force around is to be able to have all that connective tissue between all the people so that you're flexible, right? And in this case, it was they cleaved off a piece of a larger company and they put it into a small startup. They thought these large company people could easily run a small startup. Well, they got in there and they didn't have the culture of a startup company. And so they had the account managers calling directly and to the developers, and the developers, at a certain point just kind of shut down and said, we'll just wait until the next quarter when they have the next crisis. But they weren't getting anything out the door. They were starting a lot of projects, but they weren't pushing anything out the door. And so basically what happened is their organization snapped and it came to a halt. Anyway, with that, I'll go ahead and open up to questions. It's very important.
John, thank you for that presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but if you could share your contact, there you go. Anyone can reach out to you with any direct questions. And once again, thank you.
Yeah, and again, sorry for running over. And if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to chat.